thank you for coming back after the lunch break to the 2:30 graveyard session. We hope we will be entertaining enough over the next 90 minutes to keep you awake. The topic that we want to discuss is about cybercrime strategies. And cybercrime strategies also as part or also as opposed to cybersecurity strategies. When we look back at the discussions this morning in some of the workshops, yesterday, on Monday during the high-level event, when we look back at previous Internet Governance Forum, we realize that there's a lot of discussion about cybersecurity, a lot of discussion about cybercrime, but the concepts are far from clear. There is a lot of confusion. With this confusion, it's also unclear of who is responsible for what. We are not able to bring across a clear message to countries, to governments, to civil society, to the private sector of what we are really talking about. I do very much hope that during the next 90 minutes we can start sorting this out and make some progress. The intention from the Council of Europe side is that we start discussing now. We have also a discussion paper that was posted on the IGF website. We'll then continue the discussions in November in Strasbourg. We have the Global Octopus Conference, which is on 21st and 22nd of November, and on 23rd of November in Strasbourg we have the 10th anniversary of the Budapest Convention. So that is an opportunity to continue the discussion. We will have a specific workshop also there for half a day. And then possibly in the future we can develop some sort of a guidance paper or guideline to provide advice on how countries, how governments, how all the stakeholders can deal with the issue of cybercrime in a more specific manner. We'll have a number of panelists here. I will introduce them as we go along. I will ask them to introduce themselves as we go along. Each of them will speak for a maximum of 5 minutes. Each of them has one slide. Some of them have no slides, so don't worry. We have also Paul Mujene from Kenya as the remote moderator. Paul, he is there, and so this allows us also to bring in people from outside. We had last year an excellent workshop in Vilnius in Lithuania about capacity building, and we had a lot of remote moderation there, and I think this is a very important tool. With this, I would like to give the floor to the first speaker here, Marko Kunepu from Estonia, from the Ministry of Justice, and Marko is also the chairman of the Cybercrime Convention Committee. And we don't have a remote key pusher over there, but could somebody just put the next slide on? Very good, thank you. You see, this works. This is multi-stakeholderism. This is Marko's slide. Marko, you have 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you. Alexander already introduced me. My name is Marko Kunepu, and I work in the Ministry of Justice, and among other things I deal with cybercrime issues, and also I was one of the drafters of the Estonian governmental cybersecurity strategy. Just to start with, why these strategies are needed, and do we need both strategies? The answer is yes. And I think most of the countries have some sort of strategies, policy papers concerning fight against crime. Normally they should include also fight against cybercrime. But I think most of the countries right now don't have any strategies concerning cybersecurity. Estonia also was one of the countries who didn't have it until 2007, when we had cyber attacks which were also targeted against critical information infrastructure. That was an impetus for us to start drafting governmental strategy concerning cybersecurity. And this was not regarded as a criminal justice instrument or just as another crime. It was considered as threat to national security. That's why Ministry of Defense coordinated the drafting. There were several working groups. I think almost all the ministries of Estonia, including Ministry of Social Affairs, Ministry of Economic Affairs, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ministry of Defense, I already mentioned that. They were all just working with that, and then we started the working groups in June 2007, and in the beginning of 2008 we already had the final strategy. And why do we need both? Because these terms are different, and when cybercrime, fight against cybercrime, and cybercrime strategy is a criminal justice instrument. That means that there are only police, prosecutors, and courts involved. Then cybersecurity is much broader. I think I already mentioned that all the ministries are involved, and actually there are also different fields, different areas that are affected, starting from transportation, finance system, economy, even just military and political issues. They are all involved. That's why you need both these strategies. These are parallel. They should just complement each other, and also provide for a mechanism that these different institutions, these different procedures could work with each other and cooperate with each other. I already mentioned that there are parallel procedures just as regards criminal justice system. Then there's a criminal procedure which is quite bureaucratic, quite strict, and on the other hand, if you speak about cybersecurity, information security in general, then we can speak about administrative procedure. These are two different procedures, and they have different aims. Just if we speak about criminal proceeding, then the aim of the proceeding is just to collect evidences and prosecute the perpetrators. As regards cybersecurity, then the aim is to protect information system. If these information systems provide for different critical services, then government's task is to keep alive, keep running these services. I already mentioned that cybersecurity is comprehensive, and it is an interdisciplinary issue. I already mentioned that there are several fields: military aspects, political aspects, technological aspects, and also economical aspects. And the cybersecurity strategy is a document which has to take into account all these different policies, and just to combine them and provide for general targets, general aims. As regards cooperation among different institutions, then I already mentioned that there is police and there are prosecutors, but also as regards cybersecurity, then it's mostly done by different governmental organizations, CERTs, regulatory authorities, and other bodies. And for example, if you have, let's say, some sort of attack against your information systems, then it's really necessary that you have a mechanism that all these institutions could exchange information. As regards criminal proceeding, then there are quite strict rules concerning who and how gives permission for disclosure of the information and so on. And the information must move from law enforcement to governmental authorities and vice versa, because all these institutions have their role in fighting cyber attacks, for example. And what I think is the most important concerning the strategies, and we have also action plan, which is concrete actions, concrete details, list of ministries who are responsible, and deadlines. And we have also periodical review. Right now, the first cybersecurity strategy was meant for 2008, 2012. Right now, we are already gathering information and collecting input to start drafting a new strategy from 2013. This is really important because, as I mentioned, Estonia was one of the first countries actually to draft the governmental cybersecurity strategy. We can say that we were quite beginners during that time, and all these notions and definitions, we had to just define them by ourselves, because there was no international experience during that time. And that's why I think that periodical review is also really necessary, because cyber threats are just getting more and more comprehensive, and also governmental responses must be also updated. And I think that would be all. If you have further questions, I will be just ask them later.
Thank you. I think we will have each participant, each panelist to speak briefly and then collect the questions afterwards. Important to note, yes, Estonia responded to the attacks of 2007 by, in 2008, adopting a cybersecurity strategy under the leadership of the Ministry of Defense with many other institutions. Ministry of Justice, criminal justice institutions were just one of many stakeholders in that. The primary focus is national defense, critical information infrastructure, protection, and so forth. And it's very interesting when you go to international cybersecurity meetings. There's hardly anybody there from ministries of justice. Maybe US is an exception. It's usually people dealing with many other issues, but not with the rule of law, criminal justice matters. It's very important to retain. Marco said that both is needed, cybercrime and cybersecurity strategies. We noted that following Estonia in 2008, we had Australia in 2009, Canada 2010, the Czech Republic a few weeks ago, France, Germany, Netherlands, United Kingdom, they all adopted cybersecurity strategies. South Africa, India are in the process of doing the same. The United Kingdom is one of the very few countries with cybercrime strategies in addition to cybersecurity strategies. A very interesting strategy was also published not so long ago by United States of America, and I'm very happy now to have Chris Painter explain a few words on how you see from the State Department's perspective differences between cybercrime and cybersecurity.
So this
and Chris has no slide.
I have no slide, so maybe I can't even talk. I don't know. So I come into this with a perspective of I have been a prosecutor doing cybercrime. I was at the Department of Justice for a long time, working on various cybercrime issues and cybersecurity issues, and then at the White House working on our cybersecurity strategies there, and this international strategy. And then finally at the State Department, looking at the full panoply of cyber issues. So with that background, I think what I'd say is that the cybercrime and cybersecurity are really inextricably intertwined. They are very, very related, and here's how I see it. I'll agree with our Estonian colleague that there are differences, to be sure. There are differences in terms of the ministries involved. I think cybercrime clearly evolved as a national priority for many countries first. There was a lot of activity in cybercrime, including the negotiations and the writing of the Budapest Convention, the G8 high-tech crime group, and the 24/7 network that I've been privileged to help run for many years. There's been a lot of activity because I think nations understood the criminal threat, but they didn't understand the larger cyber threat and how they might protect themselves. That said, I think that we have, in the U.S., focused on this for quite some time. First, let me tell you why I think they're inextricably intertwined. I don't think you can really have strong cybersecurity if you do not have strong cybercrime laws and enforcement of those laws and international cooperation that leads to that. To use a physical world example, it is like if you did everything you need to do for cybersecurity, physical security, you bolted the doors, you locked the windows, you did everything you could, but there were no consequences for the people that broke in. That's not a solution. You need both the consequences, the criminal consequences for the people who break past those barriers, and you need to actually harden the targets. You need to take every step you can to make sure that you're resilient, you have good defenses in place, you have interactions among your government to deal with these issues. So I don't really think that you can have cybersecurity without good cybercrime enforcement. And I think they actually go together in a number of other ways too. Cybercrime cases often will reveal vulnerabilities in systems because cybercrime cases in the investigative stage could show new levels of attack or new types of attack or new groups that are attacking and new threats. And that can very easily, if governments are organized in the right way, be plowed into the network defense element, can be plowed into the certs and the other parts that you need to defend networks in countries. So they are really very, I will agree again, there are different focuses, but they are very, very closely intertwined. the U.S. has thought about this as a priority, cybersecurity and cybercrime, for some time. Cybercrime, as I mentioned, has been a focus of our Justice Department and others, and the FBI and the Secret Service. Cybersecurity, we had our first cybersecurity strategy in 2003, and that we also had some international work around the same time. So we had a cybersecurity strategy that was released in 2003. There's been a lot of work about that since then, which was a statement of some of the basic principles, and it included cybercrime in that cybersecurity strategy. In the G8 at the same time, there was principles, 11, because for some reason we couldn't do 10, 11 principles for critical information infrastructure protection that basically was aimed at countries and said, here's the things you need to have good critical information infrastructure protection, which frankly is the same as cybersecurity in my view. I mean, they're just different labels. And some of those things have national certs, make sure you do research and development, make sure you have early warning systems, and make sure you have strong cybercrime laws, make sure you have the ability to cooperate internationally. So again, cybercrime and cybersecurity were very closely intertwined there. More recently, as Alexander said, and when President Obama took office, I was part of the team that wrote the cyberspace policy review for the president. And we looked at all of our cyber security strategies, including our cybercrime enforcement and how that worked. And we wrote a report about some recommendations of how the government could be organized and how we could more effectively deal with the cybersecurity problem, but that included cybercrime again. And indeed, when President Obama gave his speech in May of 2009, where he characterized this threat as one of the greatest economic and national security threats we face as a country, a lot of the examples he gave were cybercrime examples and international cybercrime examples. So again, that shows you how these things are very closely related. Alexander mentioned the strategy was just released back in May, an international strategy for cyberspace, and that deals not just with cybersecurity or cybercrime, but it deals with all the issues in cyberspace with the goal of having a open, interoperable, secure, and reliable information and communications infrastructure. Significantly, two major parts of that document deal with cybersecurity and also cybercrime. Two of the norms that we want to build a consensus with other countries around are cybersecurity due diligence and protection from crime, which is protection from crime in the physical world and on the internet. So those are all core concepts that are looped together. The last thing I wanted to note is that this is sort of a three-legged stool. You have, on the one hand, needing to have strong laws in place that countries around the world really need to have. On the other hand, you need strong capabilities, capacity. You need trained law enforcement officers. I would submit that even though these are specialized people in the Justice Department and the Home Affairs Department often, and the Interior Departments, they need to be able to talk to other ministries, and there should be a lot of communication in ministries, not just for cybersecurity, but because of some of the cybercrime aspects and how you can share information. And then the third is to be able to cooperate internationally. It's critically important to have all of those. Alexander mentioned the Octopus conference that's coming up, which is really important. There is a training of the 24/7 network, which is about 50 countries now, that's coming up in Rome in the November timeframe. These are all important capacity building efforts. I mentioned this morning on another panel I was on that I was here in Nairobi for the first time 2 months ago, and we did a capacity building seminar with the Kenyan government for the 5 East African countries, where we talked about cybercrime and cybersecurity, both of those mixed. So I think it is important to understand that there are certainly differences, and I actually think it's good that countries are coming up with cybersecurity strategies for cybercrime because it's raising the national awareness of these issues. I would also agree with Alexander. I think my personal view is that when governments are thinking about cybersecurity, they should include the cybercrime people as well. This is for the reasons I've talked about. I think it's useful to have those perspectives together, the defense perspective and the addressing threats perspective. So you can think about mitigating vulnerabilities, but also how do you address and go after threats, and that's what cybercrime enforcement does.
Thank you. So a key point to retain: what you do for cybercrime will also help you on the cybersecurity front, and vice versa, hopefully. There are key issues that relate to both. namely the need for capacity building at all fronts, the interagency cooperation, in particular when you have different institutions dealing with cybersecurity than those dealing with cybercrime, that they closely coordinate with each other, exchange information, and then of course the capacity to cooperate internationally, both on the cybercrime and the cybersecurity front. Could somebody press the button on the... Thank you. Council of Europe has been cooperating closely in recent years with countries also outside Europe, and one of those is Sri Lanka. We had a wonderful workshop in April this year with Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, Maldives joining us in Sri Lanka, and the key organizer there was Jayanda Fernando, a driver in his own country, a driver also at the international level, and therefore very good for us to hear his views on the differences between cybercrime and versus cybersecurity and how that applies in a country like Sri Lanka.
Thank you, Alexander, for inviting me for this event. Sri Lankan perspectives were also quite unique in the sense that at the very beginning, when we were embarked on a journey where the ICT sector became a thrust area of growth from an economic perspective, and there was a lot of focus, especially over the last 7-8 years, we were rather confused as to whether we should have a cyber security framework or whether we should have a cybercrime framework. So, like how Chris Painter mentioned at the beginning of his presentation, we were grappled with all of these issues, and we thought of dealing with the legal consequences first, and that's what led to kind of a comprehensive regime to deal with a series of cybercrime strategies with several legislative frameworks all linked together. So in the early days, the legislative formula or the legislative program was driven more towards providing the enabling infrastructure, both from the electronic banking arena as well as from the electronic transaction perspective, and a lot of emphasis was given to providing and ensuring trust, integrity and reliability to electronic transactions, with the establishment of dedicated sector-specific certification authorities, both for the banking sector and for the government sector. But then having that kind of a cybersecurity strategy in a way was felt to be inadequate, because increasingly most of our critical information infrastructure was getting or facing regular cyber attacks. And Sri Lanka was a country, as many of you may know, were facing numerous issues from money laundering to terrorism financing to many other challenges with the use of ICT as a tool in all of our sectors, in the banking, private sector and even in government. And then with our telecenter across the rural community, we had even the rural BPOs, and some of those centers became points where criminal activity was being carried out. This led us to consider coordinated cybercrime strategy, and that led to a series of legislative frameworks starting from the Computer Crimes Act. But we felt that the Computer Crimes Act itself was not adequate in the context of a comprehensive cybercrime strategy. So we embarked on a mechanism to get the other sectors involved in a consultative process in formulating the necessary legal framework, and that in turn resulted in the Payment Devices Frauds Act, the Anti-Money Laundering Act, and the Terrorism Financing Act, and the preventive measures going alongside each other. All of these statutory frameworks, including the bill that is being currently formulated in Sri Lanka, which hopefully might go through this year, namely the amendment to the Obscene Publications Ordinance that will comprehensively deal with protecting minors on the internet, is all linked together with the cybercrime framework. And in that formulation, what we found as being the best formula for us to go forward was to look at models available, and we realized early on that the Budapest Convention was the best model for us to look at. And one of the best lessons that we learned from the Budapest Convention is not just to incorporate substantive provisions in the law in all of these areas that I mentioned, but to provide checks and balances and focus on human rights issues, especially in the area of law enforcement activity, in the investigation and prosecution of cybercrime related activity. So we are continually drawing from the best practices provided to us from the Budapest Convention, and we are hopeful that greater collaboration will result in better adherence to checks and balances, at least in the future. Now, the strategy itself was not just a legal or a legislative strategy. We also realized a need for other multiple strategies, including administrative as well as inter-agency cooperation. So in that context, my agency was involved in setting up the national CERT, the Sri Lanka CERT, which is a full member of AP CERT and a full member of FIRST, and the National Coordinating Center for cyber threats and incidents. And in providing that formula, we realized that a pure government-owned mechanism itself is not the way forward, that we need to bring together private sector and other communities and the technical community in the country in the technical coordination to deal with cybercrime and cyber incidents. And we are working towards creating a multi-stakeholder model, even in the governance of Sri Lanka CERT. And that is the direction in which we are heading, but it has been an extremely challenging task, at least from my perspective. Funding the Sri Lanka CERT and setting it up was one thing, but continuously ensuring that the highly skilled, trained people are paid market wages in a governmental framework has been a huge challenge. And we have somehow got over all of those challenges, and we are happy to say that one day we can, despite the criticism some of us have had to undergo, we are hopeful that in the long term we will be able to showcase a best practice model. The Sri Lanka CERT is a government-owned company, and that government-owned company model that we created in 2006 is what gave us that flexible environment. But in this interagency cooperation that we were looking at, working with the law enforcement and judicial sector and the prosecution service, we also embarked on a series of training activity, and this is where I would like to commend the support extended to us by the Council of Europe, as well as multiple donors, including the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank, who came to us with supporting mechanisms. And this is where, once again, donors also can play some kind of a limited or sometimes a significant role. It can be significant in terms of monetary contribution, but limited in the active participation. But they can play a role in supporting and helping developing countries in getting the necessary frameworks in place. We are also thankful to the other private sector efforts. Sri Lanka also signed up, the CERT signed up to the security cooperation program of Microsoft. They have benefited immensely from that. Finally, I would like to emphasize that the cybercrime strategy, as the previous speakers noted out, is a interlinked mechanism to ensuring a very good or a very well-founded cybersecurity strategy, and that is why the e-government policy adopted in December 2009, there was a dedicated provision dealing with how government and other agencies connected together with the critical ICT infrastructure should adhere to some minimum norms and practices in terms of IS policies. And we have not just looked at the Sri Lankan standards arena, we have been drawing on the best practices from the ISO models and the British Standards institutes information security best practices. So having said all that, my conclusion is that cybersecurity and cybercrime strategies are complementary of each other. One is a feeder to another, and a good cybercrime strategy will help to strengthen and ensure an excellent cyber security strategy in the long term. Thank you.
Thank you, Jayanda. I think this is an extraordinary experience that we can see in Sri Lanka, how starting with the idea of creating an enabling environment, the authorities, and Jayanda played an essential role there, more and more branched out, cover the cybersecurity issue, cover the cybercrime issue, going into setting up certs, institution building, and so not only the legal framework, being very concerned, which is rare sometimes for very often rare for ICT agencies, being concerned about conditions and safeguards with regard to investigative powers. This is very important that this is addressed in Sri Lanka as in any country. And we're also pleased to see that we can now, with the help of Sri Lanka, also work with in other countries of South Asia. This is an excellent experience. So we had the first model of Estonia, a response to an attack to set up a cybersecurity strategy. And on the other hand, Sri Lanka gradually building up the whole environment in this field. You mentioned public-private cooperation, the strong role of the private sector, and indeed, for that reason, we also have private sector here on the table, have a very important role to play. And I would like to give the floor to the next slide, to Andrew Cushman from Microsoft.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for your attendance. I'm Andrew Cushman. I'm a security strategist in the Trustworthy Computing Group at Microsoft. I've been in the security group for about 10 years. My role at this point is focused on helping governments implement security measures that build capability, and helping governments formulate security policies that are effective in achieving their goals. Microsoft has significant experience in the cybersecurity space. In the past, I have also worked in the Microsoft Security Response Center. I managed that group for 2 years. That's the group that's responsible for security updates on a monthly basis, Patch Tuesday. That's the technical side of security. I also managed a team that was about hacker outreach. Outreach to security researchers to understand what they know and how I can use that information to improve the products. And that's a human dimension of security. So at this point, I bring all of that experience. I bring the technical experience, I bring the human dimension of experience, and I bring the non-technical or the policy dimension of experience to bear on this problem. I'm happy today to be able to represent the Digital Crimes Unit, DCU, within Microsoft. This is a group that is focused specifically on cybercrime, because my roles previously have really been about security vulnerabilities and about security policy. And cybercrime is a bit different than that. As Microsoft thinks about that strategy for combating cybercrime, though, it's one that is based on innovation. We take a look at the ecosystem, and we think about how do we disrupt that through innovation. We have innovation in the technical dimension, innovation in the legal dimension, and then innovation in the ecosystem. So you could think about that from the experience I talked about earlier, technical, the human dimension, as well as the legal dimension. So a couple of examples on the legal dimension. There's the basics that you have to do. You know, there have to be criminal statutes and there has to be harmonization. We do the basics as well, but then we also have new legal strategies. We applied those in both the Wolodeck and the Rostock cases in terms of using the existing legal framework in novel ways to attack command and control centers. And again, in the technical dimension, it's about basics and it's about innovation. The basics would be, we have a team that does malware analysis and creates signatures and then supplies those signatures in the Microsoft Security Essentials suite to help clean up machines. But as I talked about, severing the head off the bot, the command and control center that we did with Wolodeck and Rostock, that's a novel technical dimension to this. We also think about it from a holistic life cycle approach, and it's a multi-stakeholder approach. And this is both within Microsoft, because as a large organization, there are lots of different constituencies, lots of different players. And you heard that on the governmental side. It's the same in the private sector. So we have the digital crimes unit that's in one division, has a different vice president, different minister. Then the Microsoft Malware Protection Center is in a different ministry or different vice president, as is the Trustworthy Computing Group. So we have a virtual team that actually bridges those communities. And then within the larger ecosystem, we have academia, industry, and certs that we collaborate with, whether this is the University of Washington or with other protectors in industry or with protectors in the governmental or pseudo-governmental role, because some certs are not necessary, not every cert is a governmental cert. And then we think about this from a feedback perspective and an action. One of the ways that I describe my job is as a program manager, whether that's in a product team or in this case in the security space, I'm a change agent. And part of my job is to go and help catalyze or help drive change in the ecosystem. With each one of these botnet takedowns that we did, we analyzed what went well, we analyzed the challenges that we had, and we fed that back into the process to improve the next one. Some of the kinds of changes that we're driving are that we now have, I'll talk just a little bit about the Rostock case, where we severed the head off of this botnet, and then we had lots of data about infected host machines that were spread out across the globe. We took that list of infected hosts and we provided those to certs around the world. We established direct communication channels with them so that the cert in a country could actually know what IP addresses are infected and could then use the existing mechanisms within the country to go and help clean those up. I would summarize the strategy that we have here in terms of it's a multi-stakeholder approach to take the tools away from the bad guys, to clean and prevent reinfection, and then to change the dynamic in the ecosystem. So to have a positively reinforcing cycle. The only positively reinforcing cycle in the cybercrime ecosystem today is from the criminal side. We really need to have a positively reinforcing environment so that each change that government or industry or academia makes reinforces the positive that's happened from before. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. We have been working very closely with Microsoft over the past few years, and it has been a very interesting and rewarding experience for us. As you mentioned botnets on several occasions in your short presentation. which we all know is probably the single biggest tool, or the most damaging tool that is available to criminals these days. And this multi-stakeholder approach to take the tools away from criminals is very important. But it's also important that once you have taken the tools away, that you bring them to justice. And that's where then the cybercrime strategies and the criminal justice response comes into the picture. I like also the term of change agents. We are all change agents. So when you go back, change the world in your country from the end of this week after the IGF. A lot, if not most, of the cybercrime happening is aimed at getting proceeds, getting criminal money, taking away money from somebody else, fraud, and so on. Therefore, it's very important that in all of this, in all the cybercrime strategies, we involve the financial sector, and therefore it's very important to have from PayPal Bill Smith here with us. If somebody could push the next slide. Oh, another one. Okay. Bill Smith from PayPal, please.
Sure. I'm Bill Smith with PayPal. I'm in a unit similar to the one Andrew just described, where such a unit exists within PayPal. In the larger group that I sit in, I sit next to these people. And I'm amazed at the work they do, and glad I don't have to do it. I just go out and talk about it. One of the things I was fortunate enough to do earlier this year was to work with two of my colleagues, Andy Steingrubel and Michael Barrett, on writing a paper that's available on our website. The URL is down at the bottom there. Oh, I see the wonderful features of formatting. I spent a lot of time getting that to fit all on one line. So if Andrew, you could take that back to Microsoft and fix that, I'd really appreciate it. But I know that's not possible. So anyway, we came up with so our paper's on cybercrime. It is a U.S. focused paper. The only reason, that's not because PayPal only cares about the U.S., is that we wanted to make some practical, real suggestions for things that could be done, and attempting to do that on an international scale is actually quite difficult. So what I'd want to do is focus on the principles that we outlined in the paper. There were 10 of them. We managed to get the 11th one out of there, and talk about those a bit. So our initially, or the early part of the paper describes cyber issues or cybersecurity. In our view, cybercrime actually is part of cybersecurity. It's considered in the same set of issues as are cyber terrorism, cyber espionage, cyber warfare. In our view, though, those issues should be at least discussed largely in different venues, where foreign ministers from the U.S. Department of State, perhaps military folks are discussing those issues, and that they have a different set of interactions that need to occur. We agree that they're very similar. There may be similar attack vectors, mitigation techniques, et cetera, between cybercrime and those other issues, cyber issues. But we believe if we're going to make real progress on cybercrime, it would be best to focus on that. So number one in our principles is involve the least regulatory change. We are not afraid of regulation, but don't over-regulate. So make laws that are effective and do what is necessary, not just find the fastest way to do something. Ensure that laws that exist can be interpreted in ways which credibly allow participants to prioritize safety. And the participants here really are anyone that's attached to the internet. Our view, though, is largely in companies. And in one of the significant issues we have, as has been pointed out, is that the criminals, the bad guys, they play by no rules. They will share anything and everything at will. And as a consequence, they have a huge advantage over both law enforcement and the private entities that are attempting to mitigate crime. And so we would encourage changes in law that allow a freer exchange of information, not infinite exchange, but a freer exchange of information when it is done with the attempt to mitigate crime or enhance cybersecurity. That puts us on a playing field that's at least a little closer to level, and things are not so out of balance between the white hats and the black hats. Make changes which reduce negative externalities in the overall ecosystem. There we're talking largely about, but not only, malware. If you have a machine that's infected, it may not bother you, but you may be part of a botnet that is then part of a distributed denial of service attack. So you are causing harm to the network or to others, and so we think reducing malware and potentially regulatory change in that area would be a good thing. The internet clearly is global. That's obvious. What may not be obvious is that change needs to occur in each country and every country more or less at about the same time. Otherwise, we end up with safe havens, not for the good guys, but for the bad guys. That doesn't mean everything must be identical or always at the same time, in same day, but if there are significant lags or the laws are significantly different, it makes it extremely difficult to mitigate. And as I think has already been pointed out, most of the crime that we see, or much of the crime that we see, is transnational. It crosses borders. Another piece of that is we need enhanced arrangements, I will say. The 19th century multilateral agreements really don't function real well in the internet age. We need, in particular, a lot of the things we see, we can't wait a day, a week, a month, a year for MLATs to take effect, and or requests that go through them and come back around. We need to take action in a minute, an hour, right? Truly in internet time. Another principle is avoid conflating related issues such as intellectual property theft, free speech, privacy, etc. We believe strongly in all of these. We believe in that IP theft is an issue. It's a significant issue. People should be able to exercise free speech. They should be able to be anonymous. We should respect privacy. At the same time, if we always bring those in, at least the discussions I have participated in, we rarely make progress on what was supposed to be the topic of conversation, crime. Instead, we talk about how if we do this, we might impinge here, or on intellectual property, we talk about ways to deal with those issues as opposed to what we talk about primarily in cybercrime, which is direct money theft or things like that generally, right? The attack actually is going on against the customer. They're losing money, and it's hard money, not soft money. Governments should not mandate nor manage technical controls. I think there is a knee-jerk reaction in some policy spaces to say, well, here's this problem, and if we do this in the technical arena, we solve the problem. Unfortunately, our adversaries are extremely agile, and they have the ability to move very quickly. And so when we impose a technical constraint on them, either they find the vulnerability in that, or they find a workaround to it very quickly. And they will always move faster than the legal system can, and the judicial system. So we need to be able to move more quickly, and we suggest against mandating technical controls. Another one we think is obvious: find things that improve security and don't compromise privacy. Okay? Again, we believe strongly in privacy, but we do not believe that these are exclusive. In fact, we maintain there is no privacy without security. Okay? If you don't have secure systems, you cannot have privacy. Full anonymity on the internet, especially in e-commerce and financial transactions, that largely impossible. Okay? Certainly it's infeasible, and you for most any transaction that is a non-trivial transaction, it's difficult to do anonymously. Let's see, 9 is treat data usage for anti-fraud purposes as distinct from data for marketing purposes. This one is specifically around do not track. That's receiving a lot of support. We're actually kind of neutral on that, I would say. But we believe if there is legislation or policies around tracking using cookies, that there be a carve-out for such tracking when it is used for fraud detection and similar things to mitigate cybercrime. It's very useful, and we would hate to see it go. Lastly, the Internet governance organizations are part of the solution, not part of the problem. So discussing things at the IGF, at ICANN, at the RIRs, they are part of the solution. They are not part of the problem. We don't need to take these issues elsewhere to discuss them. We can do it here and on other fora, and that's actually the best mechanism. If we go invent something new to try and solve cybercrime, we won't be making progress for years to come. Thank you.
Thank you. Very important elements here, and we will try to reflect those in a revised version of the discussion paper later on. You call for more efficient information exchange, and in that context, in your paper, you call the Budapest Convention antediluvian.
No, the MLATs. We may have made a mistake with the Budapest Convention.
Okay, but anyway, there's a challenge there of how we can indeed make these provisions really function and efficient. We take it as a challenge, a constructive criticism very much. And the issue on privacy versus security, actually, most of the cyber attacks are attacks on the privacy of people. Let's face it. So the more you do on cybercrime, the more you enhance privacy, if you look at it that way. With that, we are almost through with the speakers. Don't worry, there will be some time for discussion. Very pleased to have Sahid Jamil from Pakistan.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Yeah, the next slide, please. Thank you. I'm from Pakistan. I'm an attorney there, and I, amongst many things that I've done, I've drafted legislation on electronic transactions and particularly related to cybercrime. So what I'll do is I've got some notes here, but I've got 5 minutes, so I hope you will bear with me. So I apologize for the speed if we have difficulties. Now, we're talking about capacity building, and there's some sort of capacity building that has taken place in my country and also regional. And Janada, who was talking about the South Asian initiative, where the Council of Europe provided that, was an extremely helpful exercise where parliamentarians, business, and even technical experts were down in Sri Lanka, where we discussed many things on the workshop. But what are the areas of capacity building that we can sort of identify? So the first is legislative. Now let me speak about that for a second. In Pakistan, we have the Electronic Transactions Ordinance, that's just for transactions. There is the payment systems, electronic fund transfer to deal with fund transfer issues and payment systems, and the Prevention of Electronic Crime Ordinance. Now all these legislations are sort of cybercrime-based legislations. What we did with legislation was that we tried to get the best model that was available internationally. The best model, which was accepted by most countries, was there was only one. There was only one treaty in the world at the moment with regard to cybercrime. That's the Budapest Convention. So that was utilized as the basis for most of the legislation that we did in my country and whatever we sort of, when we were cooperating with other countries in our region, to say, well, legislative capacity building, look to the best. Don't look at something that's diluted. Look at the best that's available. And the advantage we found in the Budapest Convention of the Council of Europe was the following. Look, it harmonizes definitions. Now, Bill talked about the importance of harmonized definitions of cybercrime. If you have different definitions across the globe, you're going to have difficulty trying to fight it. It is technologically neutral. So it doesn't have a specific identity theft or spoofing section or clause, but it does have a technology neutral definition that allows you to actually address that issue. And it also, as another speaker has mentioned, provides safeguards and human rights protections and gives the procedural powers that law enforcement it requires to be able to implement cybercrime strategies. So that's your legislative part. Then there's procedural, which also comes as part of the legislation as a package. And so that is something that also is something that you need the parliamentarians to be on board. And as I said, regional meetings with parliamentarians where the Council of Europe actually assisted in explaining to our parliamentarians what was needed was extremely useful. When they went back, they were completely sold on this. They said, well, we're going to be the advocates within the legislature to get this to happen. Now, with regard to investigators and forensic experts, there was a training done in Pakistan. It was Microsoft as a private entity they brought in expertise. The Council of Europe came in to bring in expertise. I was one of the people who actually participated in that as well. And in that, you know, if for the past 2 years, the FBI and the Council of Europe have been doing these trainings in the country, and it makes a difference. And I'll give you an example of why it makes a difference to law enforcement as we go down with a specific example, the second last point, but I'll come to that later. The next thing you need operational technical capacity building and skills to high-tech crime units, etc. They don't know how to deal with it. They don't understand how to use computers. They don't understand how to walk in to a search and seizure environment, and they're supposed to take data out. We've seen several incidents where they are corrupting data, or their data gets infected, or the chain of custody is lost. And even countries like mine, in judgments, will say, sorry, you know, this evidence has no value because the chain of custody was broken. And so those trainings to those law enforcement become highly vital. Cooperation. Now, in cooperation, I wanted to mention 2-3 points. One is you need to have a 24/7 contact point, because cybercrime is not something that sort of takes time off at night. It happens at night, it happens globally, it happens all the time. So you need to have somebody available within your country locally. We're not just talking about international cooperation, who will be able to respond to some sort of a cyber attack within the law enforcement, not necessarily just a CERT, but within law enforcement. So that contact point is necessary. Those capacity to set up those sort of helplines, etc., would be extremely important. Interagency. I'm talking about domestic interagency. In my country, we have a federal and a provincial setup. And the biggest problem we have is the law enforcement at the provincial level says we get no cooperation from the federal level. They're not sharing information. And so who's winning in the meantime? The bad guys. Because the interagency cooperation is at a minimum or doesn't exist. And then there's cooperation which is international. And that can only happen if 2 things take place. One, legislation in that country provides for mutual MLA, mutual legal assistance. That a country basically says, all right, if I get a request from a country abroad, I will process that. It will be considered a request from any other complainant, and I will provide cooperation from my law enforcement to the law enforcement in the other country requesting country. Now, it has to be on the basis also of an international treaty. The only treaty we have right now that allows for that is the Budapest Convention. I have a quote there. I'll show you an example of what the Australians, because they're about to ratify the convention. At a recent meeting of common law ministers, I was briefed on an international police operation that smashed the largest child sex abuse case in history. After 3 years of investigation to website boylover.net, police agencies identified 70,000 members and rescued 230 children from horrific abuse across the globe. This successful police investigation into the site would not have been possible without cooperation between overseas agencies and online crime fighting capabilities. He's the Attorney General of Australia, and this is something very recent, just last month, I think a month or 2 months ago. This shows you the importance that it's not just enough to have a legislation on the ground and say we've done it as far as legislative procedural powers are concerned, but also to understand that in order to have cooperation, you need to be able to be part of an international framework or a treaty. The only one right now is a convention. Now, what I wanted to mention, what the investigators asked when we would train them with regard to international cooperation, was a simple thing. I'm an investigator in say, Pakistan. I know somebody's using either a Gmail or a Hotmail account. And what I want to do is I want to preserve that data. So I want to make a request to an entity that is in the United States. How do I do that? So the law enforcement has no, currently, if it's not signed up to the treaty, which is the convention of the Budapest Convention, has no legal mechanism by which to be able to ask for that in such a manner that it becomes an obligation on the country on the side to provide that cooperation. Because then it's really up to the country to say, maybe, okay, fine, but there's no framework. There's no international convention. And this was the biggest problem that our investigators, and this problem is shared across the globe, face unless they have that convention or they've signed up to that sort of international framework. Now let me talk about certs, and other people have talked about it, so I'm going to just say that that's important, but it takes money, it takes skill and training, so that's another thing to keep in mind when you do capacity building with regard to cybercrime strategies. And the last one, I just did training for prosecutors before I came here. And it's incredible how some prosecutors they're older. They're not necessarily younger. Some may not understand how computers work necessarily. They can use a BlackBerry, but when you ask for IP address and things, they don't understand what they need to put into court and how to put into court to be able to effectively fight a cybercrime case. So ensuring that judges as well as prosecutors are trained, and in this, the Department of Justice in my country has been doing training over the last 2.5 years. Can I have the next slide? And I'm winding up. No. Oh, there is it? Okay, sorry.
There is none. It's on
There's,
the right.
Oh, it's on the right-hand side? Sorry, one slide. Thank you, Nathaniel Alexander. So, but in this, it's not just government. It's, thank you, private sector cooperation initiatives. If it hadn't been for Microsoft to partner with COE and have advocates and attorneys present with law enforcement to train them, this wouldn't happen. So private sector involvement and initiatives in developing countries take on a very, very important role, because it's private to private cooperation and private to law enforcement cooperation that's really going to get us the results in fighting cybercrime. We've talked about the regional outreach that is required, South Asia, we had one with the COE. But I want to sort of create a segue to the next speaker to talk about a complementary initiative to the COE Convention and basically whatever international best practice that exists out there, which is the Commonwealth Cybercrime Initiative. So most Commonwealth countries have an advantage. They share the same common law. And this initiative, the purpose of this initiative basically, is to use the model Commonwealth law on cybercrime as a basis, which by the way is the same as the BSA model law. It is taken from the Budapest Convention as a model as well. And so using that model law within Commonwealth countries and filling the gaps if we need to with other things, and using that as a vehicle forward. So if you're a Commonwealth country, I would request you to come to a workshop tomorrow, but I'll let Joe, who's with the CIGF, tell you more about that. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sahid. Indeed, the capacity building side is one of the main challenges actually that we have ahead, and what the Commonwealth right now is preparing, the Commonwealth Cybercrime Initiative, will be very much welcome. Joe, if you could have 1 or 2 minutes on that, because tomorrow there will be a specific workshop on the question, so this is now a teaser for tomorrow.
Absolutely, yes. Yeah, very much so. And I don't have any slides. I'm sure that and it's really following on from the introduction of really my colleague, really Zahid, really mindful of this very desperate need for really some capacity building on the ground. The Commonwealth has really devised this initiative to to address this, and the aims of the aim of this initiative is to help really countries in realizing the necessary capacity in order to address the issue of really cybersecurity and cybercrime. One of the things that I discovered when Alexander asked me to really take part this afternoon is really I wasn't clear on what I could add to this, because I think much of what really needed to be said has been said. But in the interim, I had the opportunity to really look at the discussion paper that the councillors put together on cybercrime securities, and I would really advocate as really broader dissemination of this paper as is possible. I have found it very, very instructive, and I see this really as a first step really for a lot of countries in really starting down this road in really developing a roadmap for really what needs to be done in terms of addressing this issue of really cybersecurity and cybercrime. And I think enough has been said about the inextricable link really between the two. And really what the cybercrime, what the Commonwealth Initiative is intended to do is precisely to start off with really helping countries in the implementation of really a Commonwealth legal template that's giving them really some foundation in law that will really put them on a road, ideally, to the really Council of Europe Convention. But then going below that to provide the technical assistance that may be required in really equipping really some of these really countries with the appropriate technical environments to enable the monitoring, the investigation, the interventions that really may be required. And then at really a third level below that is to help really provide the really human capacity that is required to support this. The really Commonwealth really is an organization that consists of really 54 member countries, but it has little by way of resources as an organization itself, both by way of funds or people. So the Commonwealth in this is really a catalyst for this initiative, and it can only really provide this assistance really through partnerships with really a number of entities that have the resources and the capacity to address this, such as the really Council of Europe, the Diploma Foundation, the ICANN, and really a range of partnerships. I think I'll stop there, and I think, as really was mentioned, this is the subject of a workshop tomorrow at 11 o'clock, and we welcome you to attend that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Indeed, it will be an important capacity building initiative, hopefully adopted soon and launched very soon. And we need that and many more initiatives of that nature. To summarize, and Joe, thank you very much for referring to the discussion paper that we had prepared. I will not go through that now, because you can read it on the IGF website. And please also send me your comments on that, so that we can incorporate all your views in it. Roughly, we have cybercrime strategies, which deal with attacks against computer systems, offenses by means of computer systems, but they also have to deal with electronic evidence in relation to any crime. These cybercrime strategies would contribute to crime prevention and criminal justice, which in turn would then contribute to the rule of law and human rights. Cybersecurity strategies deal with non-intentional incidents, but also attacks against critical infrastructure and other computer systems. They are aimed at enhancing reliability, resilience, security, trust in ICT, and all of that is then aimed, when you read cybersecurity strategies, at economic, social, and other national interest and national security. And at all levels, you see there are cross-links, they reinforce each other. There's a lot of positive overlap between cybercrime and cybersecurity, even if some of the aspects have follow a different rationale, have a different finality. With that, I would like to stop at this level now, the discussion or the presentations, and invite participants here to ask questions to any of the panelists, and also the remote participants, if there are any. Please, first one here.
Hi, my name is Chris Segoyan. I'm a cybersecurity researcher at Indiana University in the States. So it's a shame that the gentleman from the State Department left, because I thought his job actually neatly sums this up. So the US government and many other governments now are encouraging internet freedom, censorship, resistance technology, circumvention technology, and one of the main things that they're funding is anonymity technologies, such as proxy services and virtual private network services that allow people to browse the web anonymously online. These have been used in the Arab Spring and in several revolutions to allow dissidents and activists to communicate anonymously. At the same time, Pakistan just this last month forced all internet service providers to start blocking access to VPN services because they're not able to intercept these communications. The FBI in March of this year held out VPN services as a particular issue that they wanted to address, because these VPN services are not keeping logs, and so they say that hackers and criminals are hiding behind them. And I'm wondering, for the folks on this stage, are you finding that VPN services and anonymity services are being pointed out as a net good or a net bad? And how is the desire to encourage freedom around the world clashing with your desire to catch people who are using these services? Thank you.
Very good. So there are lots of dialectical processes going on around the world. Perhaps, Sahid, if you want to respond to this?
Thank you. You mentioned Pakistan. That's right. Just to clarify, the VPN issue is a regulation. I saw the press cuttings, but the actual regulation has been there for a while, for the last 2 years. And all it requires is basically reporting if somebody's using a VPN. I think that's just not right. It shouldn't happen. I didn't have any part in writing that legislation. That's telecom legislation. And you're right. And it's a problem because it goes against privacy issues. People are thinking of filing a constitutional petition in court to handle that, just on that specific point. Something else which may be interesting, I'd love people to hear this, that because the Interior Minister said that I'm unable to get cooperation from Google and from Microsoft, and he mentioned another companies as well, Facebook as well, saying if they don't cooperate with me, I'm going to make sure that their representatives go to jail and hold them. And this is just the wrong way to handle this, because the reason why they can't cooperate is because that country, my country, hasn't signed on to the Budapest Convention. I mean, if they really want to get cooperation, that's what you do. You go to the treaty, you sign on to the treaty, it gives you the ability to be able to get cooperation. But you can't, as a sovereign nation, tell somebody else outside your country, well, I want your data. There's no legal mechanism to do that. So, but thank you for making that point.
Indeed, and hopefully Pakistan will soon adopt also domestic legislation, which then is a precondition for international cooperation, but also cooperation with international private sector partners on that. Who's next?
Thanks. I think this is a great panel, and I would love to ask questions to other people. But my question is going actually to Zahid as well. Zahid, I have two questions for you. The first one is, you shared your experiences when you implemented legislation, and you mentioned that you used the Budapest Convention because it was the only one that was available. I was wondering, in the end of your presentation, you mentioned that the Commonwealth Model Law in 2002 was something that was developed for Commonwealth countries. So I understand that at least for you, there are options. And I was also interested whether you look into things. I mean, we heard great presentations about identity theft, botnets, and other things that are things that have come up recently. So I would like to know if you have also looked into legislation that addresses this, as these are issues, especially identity-related crime, that are not addressed in the Convention on Cybercrime, which is 10 years old. So this is the one question. The other one was, you mentioned that there is no legal framework for international cooperation apart from the Convention on Cybercrime. And you mentioned this case that was discussed by the AJs of the Pacific countries, of the Commonwealth countries. And this was a great example because there were 80 countries involved in this operation. And the Budapest Convention, I think was mentioned in the beginning, has so far 30 European countries and the United States. So obviously there are countries cooperating outside this framework. I understand because they have bilateral agreements, there are other legal frameworks that they can use. For example, when we consider child pornography and organized crime, we can use the Organized Crime Convention, which has, I think, 150 people. So I believe that maybe you can explain a little bit why it is impossible to use other instruments of cooperation in cybercrime matters.
Thank you. Yes, the Commonwealth Model Law is actually a good model, but it's not a treaty. The advantage of the model law is, and we need to remember this, the model law is framed and based upon the Budapest Treaty. In fact, if you open up the document, you'll see right on the front page that it says that the specific instructions within the Commonwealth were that it should be modeled on the Budapest Convention, which is what we did. So we followed the Budapest Convention, which is the source document. That is not to say we ignored any of those because they were already compliant. We went to source, number one. Two, remember the convention is principles, doesn't actually dictate language, one. Two, what it doesn't do is say that this is the maximum. It says it's the minimum, because that's the minimum basis on which countries who are treaty members need to cooperate. So if you want to go ahead and add other specific provisions, you're most welcome to do that depending on the country. So that capacity is there. With regard to botnets, illegal access and other provisions within the law would already provide for that, and that's already covered in the convention, and it was covered in our legislation. In fact, it was covered in our legislation. Botnet attacks were covered as a DDoS thing, or a botnet attack was covered even before we even followed it in the earliest law, which is the Electronic Transactions Ordinance. It was one section. So we'd already covered that way before that.
Perhaps also to mention, Estonia had massive denial of service attacks in 2007, and they had implemented the Budapest Convention before, but with regard to the level of sanctions, there was an issue, and then Estonia responded to that by having a specific provision, a new provision on denial of service attacks, on this sort of system interference with different levels depending on the impact of such attacks. Bill, you had a comment?
Yeah, I wanted to comment on these things. First, I wanted to apologize for Alexander. I reread that section of our paper, and no. It was not clear. We actually are supportive of the Budapest Convention. We think more needs to be done. There need to be more signatories to it. That it is an important framework, basically. The issue, what we were talking about in the MLATs are, as an example, in the 19th century, you would send from one government, you would send a letter up the chain. It would then come across the other side. It would go back down, and months later, something might or might not happen. That is just, we can't deal in that way. The 3-year investigation with across 80 countries, things like that, that can work that way, and so frameworks and existing MLATs and bilateral agreements will be helpful. The point we're making or trying to make is that in addition to those, we need to do other things. We need faster responses. As an example, a distributed denial of service attack, when it hits, you have to be able to respond instantaneously. Phishing sites, the half-life of a phishing site is 24 hours. If we don't get to the site in the first 5, we might as well forget it. So if we're dealing with a 19th century MLAT agreement, we'll never get anything done. So we have to have lots more cooperation than we currently have. The treaties are good, the bilateral agreements are good. We just need to bring them into the 21st century.
Thank you, and of course, we are hopefully also we have more ratifications very soon. Last week, Switzerland ratified, and today a decision was made to invite one country from West Africa, which is very important that that region also becomes involved. This decision was made this morning to invite one country from South Africa to join the Budapest Convention. It's not yet formalized, that's why I cannot tell you which one. Jayanta.
Yeah. Without repeating what the previous speaker said, just to, in response to the questions that were posed, I'd just like to give my perspective. Various countries are faced with numerous challenges. And in addressing the challenges, they look at minimum standards that they can follow. And that's where we found the Budapest Convention to be an interesting model, despite the fact it may be several years old. But I think the technology neutral language provides the formula to build up on that template, and that is what we did in Sri Lanka. Just today in the morning, I just read in the local newspaper here, spies seek legal rights to tap phones, and there's a new bill concerning that being discussed in Kenya itself. So countries have their own unique problems. The way they deal with it is their problem, or how they get over it is they may have their own homegrown solutions in the way they get over it. But in ensuring appropriate checks and balances, I would think the model framework that we get from Budapest is the best example to follow. Thank you.
Thank you, China. I would like to come back to some, I mentioned, one second, but just to underline how sensitive the criminal justice process is. China also pointed it out, if your chain of custody is not clear and you present the case in court, the case will be dismissed. This is something which technology people don't always understand. It's difficult enough for lawyers, and this is very important, and therefore we need to have this rule of law, criminal justice angle when dealing with cybercrime to make sure that these sometimes details, but decisive details are fully understood. There was a question via the remote coordinator and moderator.
Okay, we have a question from the Caribbean Telecommunications Union, and they are asking, is there a specific model for the establishment of CSATs, particularly in developing countries, a sort of checklist on critical elements, recommended approach? The question was directed mainly to Alexander of the Council of Europe, but any panelist member is free to answer it.
Very good. The Council of Europe is not qualified to talk about certs. We know what we can do and what we cannot do, but we have friends here like Jayanta who has been essential in doing this in Sri Lanka. Could you reply to this question?
Yeah. If I could have the email address from the person who did send that question, I would like to elaborate and provide the tools and the information we have in our website, and any other documents that we can provide by way of elaboration. But if I may briefly answer, every country may have its own mechanism of addressing it. The way Sri Lanka did it was through a hybrid model of public-private participation. And what we decided was to create the framework of a national cert, and under that, the gradual process of consultation is resulting in sector-specific C-certs being established. And in recent times, we have also been collaborating closely with the telecom regulator and signed up to this impact kind of a framework. But because of the need for greater localized collaborative activity, we realized that we need to set up a banking C-cert, we need to set up a telco C-cert, and all that work is undergoing. And those in turn will become a feeding factor for the national cert to function. So there are different models that many countries may have. Some countries may have a more of a private sector or a public-private collaborative framework to run a national cert, or may have a purely private sector cert. Some countries have outsourced their certs to the private sector.
Thank you. I'm Sebastian Rwengabo from the Singapore Internet Research Center. We are discussing questions of general concern by the internet users about their security and the crime that goes on in the cyberspace. But I think we are neglecting one issue of the capacity to counter cyber insecurity and cyber crime. When we are talking of international instruments, when we are talking of local capacity, when we are talking of legislation, how capable are law enforcement agencies, especially in the developing world, to investigate cyber-related crime, to even detect it, to detect, investigate, and prosecute it? I think one other component of the strategies we may need to think about is the component of capacity building. I thank you.
Thank you, and that's, I think, was the point, meant by in the slides by Zahid and also by Joe Tabone about the Commonwealth Initiative, the other type of capacity building that has already been delivered. But honestly, much more needs to be done in terms of capacity building, from the training of law enforcement, but also judges and prosecutors, as pointed out, to all other elements that we have. The problem is the legal basis. It's the starting point. I've participated some years ago, a fantastic training delivered by Microsoft in Bangkok for forensic investigators for Southeast Asian countries. It's about 5-6 years ago. It was very interesting. At the 5th day, in the last day of the event, all those investigators said, "This is wonderful, we learned a lot, but it's science fiction for us. None of this is a crime in our country. We are not allowed to investigate any of this." This has changed.
Yeah, Bill Smith. It's an excellent point. Actually, in our paper for just the U.S., we suggest that law enforcement needs to be doubled or tripled, we think, at minimum. And even at that, they will not be addressing all of the crime. We point out that for shoplifting, right? If you are caught shoplifting, even a small amount of money, goods that are worth a small amount of money, you probably will get prosecuted in some way, shape, or form, or there will be some deal cut in the United States. In online theft, it has to rise to the level of $25,000 US, $50,000 US before the agencies will take it on, because there are so many cases. So in our belief is that in addition to increasing law enforcement, we also need to, as private institutions, continue our efforts. And we actually are providing much of the information to law enforcement when cases are built, because either the agencies don't have the expertise, or we are the persons who detect the crime, right? So we detect, we investigate what we see, and then turn things over. So capacity building, absolutely, we need to, as has been said, we need law enforcement, judicial, et cetera. But we also need to keep the private sector engaged. We'll never be able to turn this over to police the way real world crime is.
And the shoplifter will probably have had a mobile phone with him or her. And that will be seized by the police and given to the forensic investigators to prove that this person was at that particular moment when so electronic evidence. It's not cybercrime, it's not a cybersecurity issue, but police officers, forensic investigators have to deal with many thousand devices that are dumped on their desk to investigate and analyze and provide the evidence. Therefore, you need to train all police officers on how to deal with electronic evidence. You need to train all judges and prosecutors in the country. The capacity building need is enormous for that. I had Zahid and then Andrew.
Just a very quick point. I think it's important to stress that it shouldn't be just a flash in the pan. It needs to be institutionalized, and it should be on a rolling basis, because the attrition rate of people who actually get this training, become expert at this, and then maybe move into the private sector or elsewhere, or if they're in developing country, move abroad, is going to be high. So you need to really invest a lot of money in this area.
Two comments. One is that this highlights again the need for a specific cybersecurity plan, or sorry, a cybercrime plan that's distinct from cybersecurity, because as you author that cybercrime plan, then you say, how do I actually deal with this from end to end, and what are the resources that I need to apply, and where do I need to go and build capacity. That might get lost if you simply say cybercrime is going to be a piece of a cyber strategy. And the second is that your comment makes me think about the experience at Microsoft, where security is now part of the culture, and every developer thinks about security as they're writing code. You need to get to the point where security and cybercrime is a part of every law enforcement officer's job and part of that culture, so that they understand that. And to reinforce the point that Alexander was making, and you will have specialists, but you also need to have that culture change within the breadth of the organization.
Also, just a quick comment. We also think that capacity building is really important, and this is something which also should be addressed in the national cybersecurity strategies, because you not only just plan different kind of actions, activities, you can also just manage with limited resources. And for example, if you have strategy, if you have foreseen different kind of priorities, then these can be taken into account, for example, later when you're in your state budget planning process, just in order to locate necessary resources.
Okay, so cybercrime strategies will help you mobilize resources. Therefore, it's a good incentive. Over there.
Yeah, my name is Walubengo from Kenya. It's obvious that in Africa we lack the capacity, or we need to develop the capacity, and it's going to take time to really bring up that capacity. So I'm just wondering, is it possible that more developed SATs in Europe and America are able to monitor the African space and assist us even remotely?
Sorry, what do you mean monitor the African space remotely?
You know, given that in Africa we lack the capacity to address these issues, we automatically provide a safe haven for cyber criminals. So is it possible, like somebody in Europe could be able to detect such activities and prevent them without necessarily coming to Africa?
Well, I'm sure your governments will be very unhappy if Europeans were starting to do crime control in Kenya or elsewhere, for that matter. I think what we need to do is that the responsibility lies in the country to start with, right? That is very important, and I'm sure, Andrew, you will support this?
Well, yes. No, Alexander, that was not very nice. Thank you. Yes, that responsibility does lie within the country, but the internet is global, and there are organizations and companies today that already can tell you whether where the most spam comes from, or how many infected web servers are in a specific IP range. That information exists already. So Spam House or other blacklists exist where you can go and get that information today.
And quickly, to also to Andrew's point, yes, it's possible to, I won't say monitor, but we can pinpoint where crime is originating through IP addresses and things like that. But we can't make the leap and say, well, we're going to go prosecute in a different country. That's why we need the MLATs, the Budapest Convention, et cetera, where we will provide information, but the action needs to be taken locally.
And this goes back to the point that was made here about you can put the bars and the fences around your house, and you can put all the security, but if there's no penalty for breaking in, and so some of that information exists, but if there are no consequences in the local geography.
We have 4 more questions. Was it 1 or 2 questions? One question. Two questions. Okay. Please go ahead.
Okay, mine is not a question, it's a comment. My name is Emmanuel Kimeu. I work for an ICT security solutions provider in Kenya and the larger East Africa. And I've been in ICT security for the last 11 years. I just wanted to support what Andrew and Zaid were talking about with regard to capacity building. The biggest problem that we see in this market is the lack of awareness and at the point people consider security in their organizations. People are very fast to enable, but it takes an incidence for them to consider security as an issue, and that's the biggest problem we see. So if IGF can help in building awareness and people considering security at an early stage, it would help most of them. And you find that, for example, one country in the region has a central bank which is very proactive. Central bank has given a regulation that by next year, all financial institutions must have a forensic department. All financial institutions are implementing forensic departments, but the biggest challenge you're facing is now the courts and the prosecutors don't understand what that is. So they investigate cases, take them there, they're just thrown out. So it's a big problem.
Indeed, legal basis, and then to have everybody along the criminal justice chain involved and trained to deliver. I think regarding awareness, we should all be grateful to Estonia for having been attacked in 2007. I think that was a wake-up call for many, many governments, and that you see a lot of change after that happening in terms of cybersecurity strategies, in terms of cybercrime measures also. But it would be much better to have a systematic approach like in Sri Lanka, rather than waiting for an attack to happen. Your colleague had another question?
Thank you. My name is Didier Ngurikimfura from Rwanda Development Board. I would like to ask a question. First of all, thanking the panelists for this clear distinction between cybersecurity and cybercrime. But I would like to hear a little bit about the preventive measures to take, because cybercrime, most of the time we look at it as reactive measures to react against an offense and so on. But what are the preventive measures that can be taken in terms of awareness, for example, of end users, normal users, or other measures that can be taken? And I would like also to ask if there are global collaboration mechanisms that countries like developing countries also can use to, although it's not very mature, some legislation are not yet in place, they need to be done, but what are collaboration mechanisms that some of the countries which want to benefit can tap on and be able to use? Thank you.
Just a few comments. As comes to prevention on individual levels, and actually every individual can just join the cybercrime prevention process if they just update their computer software, just download all the necessary patches in order to the software to be updated. If necessary, they should also use anti-spyware, antivirus tools. So there are plenty of tools available which are completely free. And as comes to, let's say, business level or governmental level, then governmental level definitely should be early warning and detection system. That, for example, if governmental institutions see that something strange is going on in the cyberspace, for example, if they see that there's some sort of attack against the web server, website, then they could just notify the owners of the website and start join forces to fight these attacks. As comes to, let's say, different preventive measures, then no, it's very technical, but you can just increase the bandwidth for your internet connection. You may have backup servers, you may have parallel internet connections. So, and these are the general preventive measures. But still, for example, even if you have, let's say, 2 backup servers, both of them just could could be damaged, then the same applies if you have, let's say, parallel connections. But still, yeah, you have to foresee action plans if something like that happens. Then what are your, let's say, measures in order to mitigate possible consequences?
I think on the other question, you could also approach the Commonwealth or Zahid and myself, and we can tell you how to link up with the different initiatives that are underway. We had one question here, the second last question.
Thank you very much, Chairperson. My name is Jabu Khatebe from South Africa. First and foremost, I would like to congratulate you and your panelists for an interesting discussion. Having said that, my question is very simple. Zaid mentioned that it is necessary to have a global instrument to combat cybercrime, if I did get you correctly. I would like to know what are the views of the other panelists on that.
Sure, this is Bill Smith. We support that as well. I think, if I understand the question correctly, that we would like to see more countries signing on to the Budapest Convention. We think there are some problems with it that will prevent certain nations from becoming signatories. We would like to see those issues overcome, but we encourage it. It is essential that there be cooperation around the world because the nature of the crime, it is transnational. So there has to be agreement if we're going to make significant improvement.
Yeah, we do agree with that idea of a global instrument, but in the area of criminal justice, it's so difficult to reach conclusion in an international perspective, and that's the message I want to give. So let's, without reinventing the wheel, and from a South Asian perspective, even we were discussing this even with our Indian and Pakistani, Bangladesh and Malian colleagues, from a regional perspectives, we are looking at templates and frameworks which are available, which can meet international global norms and best practices. That's the way to go. Thanks.
Thank you. And South Africa participated in the preparation of the Budapest Convention, the signatory, and hopefully there will also be ratification in the near future. 1 second. Okay, there was one more question. Don't disappear. The question can still be asked, but Marco had a comment.
I would also like to comment that Estonia also supports the global implementation, global application of Budapest Convention, because right now this is the only legally binding instrument. And as comes to the attacks against Estonian information systems in 2007, then I can just give a practical example. During that time, we asked information from different countries, and there was actually one country who refused to provide information to us. And they explained that they had no legal obligation to do that.
Okay, there was one more question.
Sorry, Alexander. I had a slight variation on that answer, and that is that I agree that you need global interoperability. I don't know that there's a single framework that's going to work, but you need interoperability and you need dual criminality if you want to prosecute, and you need a framework for collaboration. If you want to prosecute a cybercrime that happened in your geography but originated somewhere else.
Okay, last but not least, is the person still here? Yeah. Please.
Hello. Thank you very much for that chance, the panel. I'm Daniel Omondi, a founder of Dotto Computer Agency based in Nairobi. This case you are talking about, I think basically what we need to check first is the technicality. What our friend said from Microsoft. I think we need to look at the technical aspect first. Like those who develop the software, there should be the security part which prevent even the breaking into to have criminal activities on the cyber. That is what should be dealt with first. Then we go into, like, we can enhance sniffers in the networks, which can be checking and alerting the respective nodes, which can later on, like tsunami detectors, they detect before the tsunami comes in. We need to develop something like sniffers which can detect the crime before it is taken place. And I think another thing is, when you mention about the capacity building to respective governments, you are doing capacity building to respective governments, and majorly I think it should be on either side, both sides. It should go to non-governmental organizations too, because the government cannot operate alone. It must operate with the non-governmental organizations so that they work together. Then the third part was the policy issues. I think when we are in a global village. So when we want to make the policies, we should work on these policies as we are in the same village. And we want to make it, let us not say that the other village is better than this village. Why don't we just make all the villages to be equal? Then we enjoy being in them. Thank you.
Thank you. This is an excellent concluding remark for the whole workshop. Capacity building is multi-stakeholder, should cover everybody, and we should all consider ourselves in the same village. And we should also be reasonable. And we can all be reasonable as long as politics doesn't interfere. And that's the problem, very often. I think the technical and practical solutions are there. It's now a question of making sure they're implemented. And let's keep the political issues a bit outside and deliver practical results and make an impact. With that, thank you to all for bearing with us this afternoon, and an applause for the panel. And if you have any comments on the discussion paper, send them to me. I will make sure to reflect them.